The salvage ship New Horizon drifted through the thick purple clouds of the Kepler Nebula like a tiny metal fish swimming through cosmic soup. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge watching the sensor readings with tired eyes. 3 weeks of searching and they had found nothing but space junk and old asteroid fragments. His crew was getting restless and their fuel was running low. Morrison was a tall man with graying hair and hands that showed the wear of 20 years working salvage ships. He had been doing this job since he was 18 years old, and he knew the difference between worthless scrap and something that could pay the bills. Today felt different, though. The sensors were picking up something big hidden deep in the nebula's dense gas clouds. Chief Engineer Lisa Rodriguez climbed up from the engine room, wiping grease from her hands with an old rag. She was small and tough with dark hair tied back in a ponytail and eyes that missed nothing when it came to machines. Rodriguez had kept the New Horizon running for 5 years with spare parts and determination. Morrison pointed at the main screen where a faint signal pulsed like a heartbeat. The object was massive, but the nebula's interference made it hard to get clear readings. Rodriguez studied the data and shook her head. Whatever was out there was at least 10 times bigger than their ship. Navigation Officer Danny Wright looked up from his console with excitement in his young face. He had only been with the crew for 6 months, but he was good with computers and sensor arrays. Wright had found something interesting in the signal patterns. The energy signature was human, but it was old. Really old. Morrison felt his heart skip a beat. Human military ships from before the war were worth more than anything else in known space. The Galactic Coalition had spent 60 years collecting and destroying every piece of pre-war human technology they could find. If this really was what Wright thought it was, they could all retire rich. The Coalition controlled everything now. 7 alien species had joined together to form the most powerful government in the galaxy. Humans had fought against them 60 years ago in the Terran Independence War, but they had lost badly. Now human ships were limited to small cargo vessels and mining barges. No weapons, no military technology, no freedom to explore beyond the borders the Coalition had set for them. Morrison had been born 20 years after the war ended, but he had heard the stories from older spacers. They talked about massive human battleships that could fight entire alien fleets. They spoke of technology that could bend space and time. Most people thought those stories were just legends, but Morrison had always wondered. Rodriguez checked her instruments again and confirmed what Wright had found. The signal was definitely human and it was definitely military. She estimated the ship was almost 3 kilometers long, which would make it a Supercarrier class vessel. Only a handful of those had ever been built, and all of them were supposed to have been destroyed in the final battle of the war. Wright plotted a course through the nebula's safest passage. The gas clouds were dense with charged particles that could fry their electronics if they were not careful. It took 2 hours of slow flying before they finally got close enough to see their target. Morrison stared at the main screen and felt his breath catch in his throat. The ship floating before them was enormous beyond anything he had ever seen. Its hull was dark gray metal that seemed to absorb the nebula's purple light. The design was clearly human, but it was sleek and deadly in a way that made his old salvage ship look like a toy. Rodriguez ran every scan she could think of while Wright checked the ship's identification codes against their database. The results made them all go quiet. According to the records, this was the UES Defiance. It was the flagship of Admiral Kate Sullivan, who had led the final desperate defense of Earth. The ship was supposed to have been destroyed, along with its entire crew. But here it was floating silent and dark in the middle of nowhere. Morrison was studying the tactical displays when their proximity alarm started screaming. A Coalition patrol ship had just dropped out of hyperspace less than a kilometer away. The vessel was sleek and white with the blue and gold markings of Coalition authority. Morrison cursed under his breath and ordered Wright to power down their engines. The Coalition ship was a Saurian design built by the reptilian species that served as the Coalition's primary military force. It was 3 times the size of the New Horizon and armed with plasma cannons that could vaporize them in seconds. Morrison had dealt with Coalition patrols before and he knew the rules. Cooperate completely, and maybe they would let you live. A harsh voice crackled over their communication system, speaking heavily accented English. Commander Veltar of the Saurian Colonial Guard ordered them to stand down and prepare for boarding. His tone made it clear that arguing would be a very bad idea. Morrison activated their emergency beacon and transmitted their salvage claim codes. Under Coalition law, any human ship that found derelict technology had 24 hours to file a claim. before other parties could interfere. It was one of the few rights humans still had, and Morrison intended to use it. Veltar's response was a hissing laugh that sounded like steam escaping from a broken pipe. He informed Morrison that all pre-war human military assets belonged to the Coalition by treaty, regardless of who found them. The salvage laws did not apply to weapons of war. The Saurian commander ordered them to abandon their claim and return to the nearest human colony. Any attempt to board or examine the derelict would be considered an act of terrorism. Morrison watched helplessly as Coalition Marines in powered armor jetted across space toward the massive carrier. But something made Morrison look more carefully at the derelict ship. Rodriguez had left her passive scanners running, and the readings showed something that made his heart race. Deep inside the enormous vessel, something was still active. Power levels were minimal, but they were definitely there. The ship was not completely dead. Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He told Wright to plot a course that would take them around the far side of the carrier, where the Coalition ship could not see them. Rodriguez objected that they would be breaking about 50 different laws, but Morrison did not care anymore. He was tired of being told what humans could and could not do. He was tired of watching his people scrape by on the leftovers of a galaxy that treated them like servants. If there was even a chance that this ship could change things, he had to take it. The New Horizon slipped quietly through the nebula's glowing clouds toward humanity's forgotten past and an uncertain future. The New Horizon approached the massive carrier from its blind side, where the Coalition patrol ship could not detect them. Morrison watched his screens carefully as Wright guided their small vessel toward what looked like a docking bay on the derelict's port side. The bay doors were closed, but Rodriguez had found an emergency airlock that might still be functional. Morrison suited up in his old EVA gear while Rodriguez and Wright prepared the docking equipment. The airlock seal looked intact, which was amazing after 60 years floating in space. Morrison had seen plenty of derelict ships before, but none of them had been preserved this well. Most spacecraft fell apart after a few decades without maintenance. Security Chief Rick Palmer joined Morrison for the boarding party. Palmer was a former colonial guard who had served his mandatory service time and chosen to work civilian salvage rather than stay in the military. He was quiet and careful, with suspicious eyes that never missed potential danger. Palmer carried a basic plasma cutter for emergencies, since humans were not allowed real weapons. The airlock cycled properly, and Morrison felt artificial gravity pull him down as soon as he stepped inside the carrier. That meant the ship still had power running to its essential systems. Rodriguez had been right about the energy readings. Something was definitely keeping this massive vessel alive. The corridor they entered was dark, but emergency lighting strips activated as they walked forward. The walls were made of some kind of advanced metal that looked brand new despite being 6 decades old. Morrison ran his hand along the surface and marveled at how smooth and strong it felt. Human engineering from before the war had been incredible. Wright stayed behind on the New Horizon to monitor Coalition patrol movements, while Palmer and Morrison explored deeper into the ship. They found crew quarters that looked like they had been abandoned yesterday. Personal belongings were still sitting on desks, and beds were still made with military precision. It was like walking through a ghost town. Morrison used his portable scanner to map their route as they moved toward what his readings indicated was the main computer core. The ship's layout was logical but enormous. They passed through multiple decks in sections that could have housed thousands of crew members. This was not just a warship, but a floating city designed for long missions far from home. Palmer found something interesting in what looked like a command briefing room. Wall displays were dark but still functional, and when he touched one, it flickered to life, showing star charts and tactical data. The information was all from 60 years ago, but it painted a picture of humanity's final desperate stand against the Coalition forces. Morrison felt a chill as he read the mission reports and casualty lists. The war had been even worse than the history book said. Entire human colonies had been wiped out, and millions of people had died fighting for their independence. The Coalition had overwhelming numbers and superior technology, but humans had fought anyway, because they refused to surrender their freedom. They reached the computer core after 2 hours of careful exploration. The chamber was huge, with banks of processing units that hummed with quiet power. At the center was a holographic display that activated as soon as they entered. A woman's voice spoke to them in clear English, asking for identification codes. Morrison looked at Palmer, who shrugged and stepped forward. The voice belonged to an artificial intelligence system that was still running after all these years. Morrison had heard that pre-war human ships had advanced AI, but he had never seen one in operation. Coalition law strictly forbade humans from developing or using artificial intelligence. The AI identified itself as Liberty and asked again for proper authorization codes. Morrison explained that they were a civilian salvage crew and that the ship had been listed as destroyed for 60 years. Liberty seemed to process this information for several long moments before responding. Morrison felt his heart stop when Liberty addressed him by name and rank. The AI had somehow scanned his biometric data and identified him as Captain Jake Morrison of the Terran Merchant Marine. It was asking if he was there to reactivate the ship and return it to service under human command. Palmer grabbed Morrison's arm and whispered that they needed to be very careful. Coalition monitoring systems might be listening, and any indication that they were trying to activate military technology would bring serious consequences. But Morrison was fascinated by what Liberty was telling them about the ship's capabilities. The AI explained that the UES Defiance had not been destroyed in the final battle as everyone believed. Admiral Kate Sullivan had ordered the ship to withdraw and hide in the Kepler Nebula, where it could wait for humanity to reclaim it. Liberty had been programmed to maintain the ship's systems and preserve the crew until rescue arrived. Morrison asked what Liberty meant by preserving the crew. The AI directed them to a section of the ship that contained hundreds of stasis pods. Most were empty, but dozens still showed active life signs. The original crew of the Defiance was still alive and sleeping after 60 years of waiting for someone to wake them up. Rodriguez contacted them from the New Horizon with urgent news. The Coalition patrol ship was moving around to their side of the carrier and would detect them within minutes. They needed to return immediately or risk being captured. Morrison wanted to stay longer, but Palmer insisted they had pushed their luck far enough. Liberty seemed to understand their situation and quickly downloaded technical data to Morrison's scanner. The information included ship specifications and something called the Phoenix Drive, which appeared to be some kind of advanced, faster-than-light system. The AI promised that much more was available if they could return with proper equipment. Morrison and Palmer made it back to their ship just as Coalition scanners began sweeping their area. Wright had the engines warming up, and they slipped away into the nebula's concealing clouds before the aliens could lock onto them. But Morrison's mind was racing with possibilities that could change everything for humanity. The technical data Liberty had given them was beyond anything the Coalition allowed humans to possess. If they could somehow reactivate the Defiance and its crew, they might have a chance to challenge the aliens who had kept humanity under their boot for 6 decades. But first they needed to get this information to people who could understand what it meant. Morrison made another decision that would have consequences none of them could imagine. Instead of reporting to Coalition authorities as required by law, he ordered Wright to set course for the outer colonies, where humans who remembered the old days might still believe in fighting for their freedom. Admiral Kate Sullivan opened her eyes to darkness and the taste of stasis fluid in her mouth. The pod's life support systems hummed quietly around her as she tried to remember where she was and why everything felt wrong. Her last clear memory was ordering the Defiance to retreat into the nebula while Coalition forces overran the outer defense perimeter around Earth. The stasis pod opened with a soft hiss, and Sullivan sat up slowly, feeling 60 years of sleep in her bones. Emergency lighting activated automatically, and she could see rows of other pods stretching away into the distance. Most were empty, but she counted at least 40 that still showed active life signs. Her senior staff had survived the long sleep just as she had hoped they would. Sullivan was a woman of 55 years with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much war. She had commanded the Terran Navy's most powerful ship during humanity's darkest hour, and she had made the hardest decision of her life when she chose to preserve her crew rather than die fighting a hopeless battle. Now she was awake, and she needed to understand what had happened to her people. Liberty's voice welcomed her back and began briefing her on current conditions. The AI explained that Captain Morrison and his salvage crew had discovered the ship 3 days ago, and that Coalition forces were searching the nebula for any sign of human activity. The galaxy had changed dramatically during her long sleep, and none of the changes were good for humanity. Sullivan listened with growing anger as Liberty described 60 years of Coalition rule. Humans were restricted to small ships and forbidden from developing advanced technology. They worked as laborers and miners while alien species controlled all military and political power. The proud Terran Federation had been reduced to a collection of supervised colonies with no rights and no hope. The Admiral stood up from her pod on unsteady legs and began checking on her senior officers. Tactical Officer Chris Morgan was already awake and helping Medical Officer Amy Foster revive the rest of the command crew. Chief Science Officer Helen Parker emerged from her pod looking confused but alert. These were the people Sullivan had trusted with her life and the future of humanity. Parker immediately began analyzing the technical data that Morrison had left behind. The young captain had provided detailed scans of Coalition patrol ships and weapon systems, along with intelligence about current human settlements. More importantly, he had included a message asking for Sullivan to contact the underground resistance movement that still existed in some outer colonies. Sullivan felt a mixture of pride and sadness as she learned that some humans had never stopped fighting. Groups of former military personnel and civilian rebels had been conducting small operations against Coalition authority for decades. They had limited resources and no real hope of success, but they refused to accept defeat. These were her kind of people. Morgan activated the ship's tactical systems and began assessing their military situation. The Defiance was still 90% operational after 6 decades of automated maintenance. Its weapon systems were far superior to anything the Coalition currently deployed, and its defensive capabilities were beyond their comprehension. But one ship could not fight the entire galaxy, no matter how advanced it was. Foster finished her medical checks on the revived crew and reported that everyone was healthy despite their long sleep. The stasis technology had worked perfectly, and there were no signs of physical or mental deterioration. Sullivan had 43 of her best people, awake and ready for duty, but she needed to understand the current strategic situation before making any major decisions. Parker discovered something remarkable in the ship's manufacturing systems. The Defiance had been designed as a long-range exploration vessel capable of operating independently for years at a time. Its automated factories could produce everything from replacement parts to small spacecraft, using raw materials collected from asteroids and gas clouds. They were completely self-sufficient. Sullivan called her senior staff together in the main briefing room and laid out their situation with brutal honesty. Humanity had lost the war and accepted subjugation rather than extinction. The Coalition believed all pre-war military assets had been destroyed and would stop at nothing to eliminate any threat to their control. The Defiance represented hope, but it also represented the greatest danger humanity had faced since the original invasion, Morgan suggested. They could use the ship's advanced stealth systems to conduct hit-and-run attacks against Coalition targets. The quantum fighters in their launch bays were completely invisible to alien sensors, and their plasma weapons could destroy any known ship design. A campaign of selective strikes might weaken Coalition resolve and inspire human resistance. Parker disagreed and argued for a more cautious approach. She wanted to study Coalition technology and develop countermeasures before revealing their existence. The Phoenix Drive system could be modified to create faster-than-light communication networks that would allow human settlements to coordinate without Coalition interference. Information was more valuable than weapons. Foster pointed out that they had a moral obligation to help their people regardless of the risks. 60 years of oppression had broken the human spirit and reduced a proud species to servants and slaves. The mere knowledge that the Defiance existed would give hope to millions of humans who had given up believing in freedom. Sullivan listened to all their arguments before making her decision. She had spent 60 years in stasis thinking about this moment, and she knew exactly what needed to be done. Humanity would not remain on its knees any longer. The Coalition had made the mistake of believing that humans could be permanently defeated, but they were about to learn otherwise. The Admiral ordered Liberty to begin full reactivation of all ship systems. She wanted weapons, charged shields raised, and the Phoenix Drive prepared for immediate departure. Then she instructed Parker to locate Captain Morrison and his crew so they could coordinate with the resistance movement. The time for hiding was over. Sullivan's final order sent chills through her staff. She told Morgan to prepare a message for broadcast on all Coalition frequencies. After 60 years of silence, humanity was about to announce its return to the galaxy. The message would be simple and direct. The human species would kneel to no one ever again. The Defiance powered up completely for the first time in 6 decades, and its massive engines began charging for departure. Deep in the Kepler Nebula, something stirred that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization and remind every species why humans had once been feared across the stars. The message broadcast from the UES Defiance reached every Coalition monitoring station within 3 light-years, and the response was immediate panic. Admiral Sullivan had kept her words simple and direct. Humanity was no longer accepting Coalition authority, and any ship that attempted to interfere with human operations would be destroyed without warning. On the mining station Omega-7 dockworker, Tony Martinez was unloading cargo containers when the announcement came through the emergency communication system. He stopped working and stared at the speakers in disbelief. For 30 years he had been moving boxes and breathing recycled air, while Saurian overseers treated him like a machine. Now someone was telling him that humans could fight back. Martinez looked around at his fellow workers and saw the same expression on every face. Hope mixed with fear and uncertainty about what this meant for their daily survival. The Saurians who ran Omega-7 were not known for their patience with human disobedience. But Martinez had heard enough. He walked over to the nearest overseer and told him in clear words that his shift was finished. The Saurian responded with the usual threats about work, quotas and punishment details, but Martinez was no longer listening. He gathered the other dock workers and explained that they had a choice to make. They could keep loading boxes for aliens who despised them, or they could take control of their own lives. The decision was unanimous. On the agricultural world, New Texas farmer Beth Crawford was repairing irrigation equipment when her daughter came running from the farmhouse with news about the broadcast. Crawford had been born on New Texas and had never seen Earth, but she knew the stories about human independence and the war that had ended their freedom. Her grandfather had fought in the Terran Navy before being forced to become a farmer. Crawford gathered her neighbors and explained what the message meant for their community. New Texas produced food for Coalition military bases throughout the sector, and their crops fed the same aliens who kept humanity under control. She suggested that it might be time to stop feeding their oppressors and start feeding their own people instead. The local Coalition administrator was a bureaucrat from the trading species called the Nexus Collective. He had always been polite but firm about production quotas and shipping schedules. When Crawford and 50 other farmers surrounded his office and demanded an end to forced labor contracts, he seemed genuinely confused about why they were upset. Sullivan received reports from human settlements throughout Coalition space as news of the Defiance spread. Some communities were too frightened to act, but many others were finding the courage to resist. Underground networks that had operated in secret for decades were suddenly coordinating open rebellion. The galaxy was about to learn that humans had never really accepted defeat. Captain Morrison and his crew had made contact with the resistance cell on New Angeles and were providing technical support for their operations. Morrison found himself promoted to strategic advisor and was helping Sullivan understand current Coalition military capabilities. The aliens had grown complacent during 60 years of peace, and their forces were not prepared for serious resistance. Chief Science Officer Parker had been studying Coalition technology and had discovered several critical weaknesses in their systems. The aliens relied heavily on centralized command structures and automated systems that could be disrupted by targeted electromagnetic pulses. More importantly, their ships were designed to fight other alien vessels and had no defenses against human quantum technology. The Coalition response came in the form of Admiral Thexnor of the Insectoid, Vex-High species leading a task force of 12 heavy cruisers and 4 dreadnoughts. The Vex-High were the Coalition's primary military specialists, and Thexnor was considered one of their finest strategic minds. His orders were simple: capture or destroy the human vessel and restore order to the affected colonies. Sullivan studied the approaching fleet through the Defiance's long-range sensors and felt something like satisfaction. The Coalition was sending exactly the kind of force she had expected based on their standard tactical doctrine. They were treating her ship like a conventional threat that could be overwhelmed by superior numbers. They had no idea what they were really facing. Tactical Officer Morgan had spent days preparing for this moment. The Defiance's quantum fighters were invisible to Coalition sensors and could phase through enemy shields at will. The ship's plasma cannons could cut through Coalition armor like it was paper. Most importantly, the Phoenix drive allowed them to appear anywhere in the battle space without warning. The first engagement took place near the Rigel system where Thexnor had positioned his fleet to intercept the Defiance. Sullivan allowed the coalition ships to detect her approach and form their standard battle formation. Then she demonstrated why pre-war human technology had been so feared by every species in the galaxy. The Defiance simply vanished from coalition sensors and reappeared directly behind their battle line. Before the aliens could react, Sullivan's plasma cannons had destroyed 2 heavy cruisers and severely damaged a dreadnought. The quantum fighters swarmed through the enemy formation like deadly ghosts that could not be targeted or stopped. Thexnor tried to adapt his tactics, but his ships were designed for conventional warfare between species with similar technology levels. The humans were fighting with weapons and techniques that violated everything the Coalition understood about space combat. Within 2 hours, half of his fleet was destroyed or disabled. The battle ended when Sullivan broadcast an offer of mercy to the surviving Coalition ships. Any vessel that withdrew immediately would be allowed to leave unharmed. Those that continued fighting would be destroyed. Admiral Thexnor chose to retreat and Sullivan let him go. She wanted the Coalition to understand that humans could be reasonable when their opponents showed wisdom. Parker had been monitoring Coalition communications during the battle and reported that panic was spreading throughout their military command structure. Reports of impossible human technology and devastating losses were being transmitted to Coalition headquarters faster than they could be suppressed. The myth of Coalition invincibility was crumbling. Sullivan knew that this first victory was only the beginning. The Coalition would respond with larger fleets and more desperate tactics, but she also knew that something had changed in the galaxy. Humans throughout Coalition space were watching and learning that their oppressors could be defeated. The age of submission was ending and the real war for human freedom was about to begin. Supreme Chancellor Korthval of the hegemony species stood before the Coalition High Council and delivered an ultimatum that would determine the fate of humanity. The reptilian leader's voice echoed through the chamber as he demanded immediate action to end what he called the human terrorist threat. Either the rebels would surrender within 72 hours or the Coalition would begin systematic destruction of every human colony in known space. Admiral Sullivan received the ultimatum aboard the Defiance while her ship traveled through hyperspace toward the Sol system. The Coalition had assembled their largest fleet in history around Earth, with over 300 warships including their most powerful dreadnoughts. Korthval intended to use humanity's homeworld as bait to draw Sullivan into a battle she could not possibly win. Sullivan called her senior staff together and studied the tactical situation with calm eyes. The Coalition fleet outnumbered them by impossible odds, but she had learned during the Independence War that numbers were not everything. Human ships had always been outnumbered, and they had fought anyway because some things were more important than survival. Freedom was one of those things. Captain Morrison had joined the Defiance crew as strategic advisor, and he brought disturbing news from the resistance networks. Coalition forces were already moving against human settlements and taking hostages to force compliance. On New Texas, Beth Crawford and her farmers were surrounded by Saurian troops demanding surrender. On Omega-7, Tony Martinez and his dock workers were barricaded in the cargo bays fighting for their lives. Chief Science Officer Parker had been working around the clock to modify the Phoenix drive for what she called Operation Phoenix. The plan was ambitious beyond anything ever attempted in space warfare. Parker wanted to use the drive system to create multiple versions of the Defiance that could appear simultaneously throughout the Coalition fleet. It was theoretically possible, but had never been tested in actual combat. Tactical Officer Morgan was skeptical about the plan, but he had prepared conventional alternatives if the experimental technology failed. The quantum fighters could conduct hit-and-run attacks while the main ship used its superior speed to avoid being surrounded. It would not be enough to defeat the entire Coalition fleet, but it might allow them to escape and continue the resistance. Medical Officer Foster had been treating wounded resistance fighters who were brought aboard during supply runs to human settlements. She reported that morale among the rebels remained high despite Coalition retaliation. Humans throughout the galaxy were watching to see if the Defiance could stand against impossible odds. Their courage depended on Sullivan, proving that victory was possible. The battle began when the Defiance dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system and broadcast a message to Earth and every human colony within range. Sullivan's words were simple, But they carried the weight of 60 years of oppression and the hope of future generations. She announced that humanity would never again bow to alien masters, and that freedom was worth any price. Coalition Supreme. Admiral Korthval ordered his fleet to surround and destroy the human ship, but Sullivan had other plans. She activated Parker's modified Phoenix drive, and the impossible happened. 5 identical copies of the Defiance appeared simultaneously throughout the Coalition formation. Each one was completely real and fully armed with weapons that could devastate any ship in known space. The Coalition fleet found itself fighting an enemy that existed in multiple places at once. Their targeting systems could not lock onto ships that flickered in and out of normal space. Their tactical computers crashed, trying to track targets that violated the basic laws of physics. Within minutes, the carefully organized formation dissolved into chaos. Morgan coordinated the attack from the primary Defiance, while the other versions operated under Liberty's control. Plasma cannons fired in perfect synchronization to overwhelm Coalition shields. Quantum fighters swarmed through enemy formations like deadly ghosts that could not be stopped or even detected. The most powerful fleet in galactic history was being torn apart by technology they could not understand. But the real turning point came when other Coalition species began to question why they were fighting. The peaceful Etherians had joined the Coalition for protection, not conquest. The trading-focused Nexus Collective wanted prosperity, not genocide. When they witnessed human courage in the face of impossible odds, some of them remembered why they had originally allied with other species. Admiral Velnoth of the Etherian peacekeeping fleet was the first to withdraw her ships from the battle. She broadcast a message explaining that her people would not participate in the destruction of an entire species. The Nexus Collective followed her example within the hour. The Coalition was fragmenting as member species refused to support Korthval's war of extermination. The battle ended when Korthval himself was forced to call for a ceasefire. His remaining ships were outnumbered by those that had withdrawn from combat. The hegemony military doctrine had never prepared for fighting alone against enemies who refused to accept defeat. Sullivan graciously accepted his surrender and offered terms that would end the conflict. The peace negotiations took place aboard the Defiance with representatives from every major species in known space. Sullivan demanded complete independence for humanity and the right to reclaim all territory that had been taken during the war. She also insisted on reparations for 60 years of forced labor and technological suppression. The Coalition had little choice but to agree. Morrison found himself appointed as the first ambassador to the new Terran Federation, while Palmer became head of the reformed human military. Rodriguez was promoted to chief engineer of the shipyards that would build humanity's new fleet. Wright became the first captain of a Phoenix drive-equipped exploration vessel designed to carry human civilization to distant stars. The galaxy watched in amazement as humans began expanding beyond their original territory using technology that seemed almost magical. The Phoenix drive allowed them to travel faster and farther than any other species. Human colonies appeared in distant systems that had been considered unreachable. The oppressed species had become the most advanced civilization in known space. Sullivan accepted the position of first president of the independent Terran Federation, but she kept the Defiance as her flagship. The massive carrier became a symbol of human determination and a reminder that freedom could never be permanently defeated. As long as one human remained willing to fight tyranny, would never have the final victory. The final scene showed human exploration, ships heading toward the galactic rim where unknown worlds waited to be discovered. The galaxy had learned a hard lesson about underestimating human determination. The species that had once been forced to their knees was now leading the way to a future where freedom meant more than mere survival.